Welcome back, friends and fellow philosophers, to this Wild Isle podcast. I have back with me my fiance, JJ. Say hello to everyone, JJ. All right, we are here today to talk, among other things, about the state of education. I think it'll be quite interesting. We both have, I think, at this point, very strong opinions on that subject. But before we begin, I want to send you all over, as I always do, to my website, wildislelit.com, where you can check out my essays, like my analysis of the Barbie film. I think I've pitched that a million times. I've got stories and excerpts up as well. My whole novel, Want Smoke Broken, is up on audio on my website as well. Again, at wildislet.com. Check that out. Give the whole thing a listen. The whole book is up there free for your listening pleasure. And if you like it, go, or if you don't like it even, go ahead and give it a review. Want to know what you guys think. And if you're an author and you're looking for an editor out there, particularly a line editor focused on style and theme, you could hire me at the Wild Isle Style Guide. Again, at wildislet.com. Do I have anything else to pitch? No, I don't think I do. So without further ado, let's get into it. So, the state of education. Um, that's probably a good name for the episode, I think, because education as it is at least here in the United States of America, mostly handled by the state. And I really think that is a huge problem because it sets up what I'm not really guessing here because I've been in the education, I've taught at university, in terms of just, let's say, dealing with large masses of kids. I've done like some types of childcare work in the past. So I have some experience with this, but I think it sets up teachers of a wide variety with what I would call an impossible task that they cannot do it. It's not possible to successfully educate a group of 20, perhaps even a group of 15 or 10 children, unless that group of children are already, let's say, enculturated very well and somewhat educated by their parents, not by their teachers, but by their parents. So that's a huge, big opening. Opening preamble is redundant. It's a big preamble. JJ, what do you think of my assertion there? Do you think it's the case that teachers of a wide variety have an impossible job before them trying to educate the youth?
I I believe so because I think as parents, no offense, but are less and less educated in parenting and they're giving their children screens, iPads, phones earlier and earlier. Um, they are basically giving their kids to the internet to be raised instead of putting in effort themselves. They're doing the bare minimum of feeding them, but they're not having sleep routines for them. They're not giving them responsibilities. They are not um, teaching them any moral lessons because we know people are drifting away from religion, and that's okay. But when there's not even any moral framework at all, and like no effort towards um, really teaching your children any morals, they are just going around learning to be manipulators, master manipulators of everybody around them, and entitled children who expect everybody to do everything for them and them to have to do nothing in return.
Yeah, you definitely see that. The entitlement, right? That's a word that likes to get thrown around quite a bit, particularly as, let's say, the political sphere catches up culturally, which it has to, for good and ill, to be honest. So we've got these kids, they're entitled, they don't have moral guidance, they haven't been given responsibilities, they haven't, let's say, had their lives routinized to be orderly. That's something that we're saying that we're seeing here. If I were to play a devil's advocate, I would say that in the past, um, you didn't really have necessarily any more educated parents, right? Because you started out by saying, well, their parents are uneducated, and part of me thought, well, have we not? always had the masses, have they not always been uneducated people? I guess that's a question I'll throw back to you. Like, go back a couple hundred years, surely education was less universal. Particularly in the United States, we know that for certain. And so, is it really education that is leading to the lack in all these other domains, or is there perhaps something more fundamental underneath that?
More fundamental. You're right. That was a mistake on my part. I don't think it's a lack of education. I think it's actually, um, again, an entitlement of the parents of believing that they know better than their parents, which they may know better in some regards. But I think a lot of people that are young parents now, they rightfully so see the wrongs of their parents, but they completely dismiss and don't understand what their parents did right. So they're throwing out the baby with the bathwater and everything that um, their parents did, and they're trying to do everything they can. I know their intent is good. They're trying to give their kids the best life that they possibly can. Um, but then in doing that, their kids are just becoming entitled, spoiled brats.
It almost sounds to me that let's say the youth of perhaps most days, right? Because this is an old, I don't want to call it a stereotype. That's not the right word, but it's normal to say that the youth find their parents to be out of touch with the times, man. Like you're just an old foddy, or what's the word, fogey? I don't know the word. But they're old, right? And they don't know what the hell they're talking about, and so they're not, let's say they have not progressed far enough along the I don't know, arc of history. If we want to be Hegelian about it, evil wizards. But that's been around, that idea, and that sentiment, that notion has been around for a long time. The question would be, why is it that, or even, see, I would assuming, has it accelerated, or have we just become more aware of that fact, right? Like, is it the case that, let's say, um, the youth today really have, to an increasing degree, dismissed the wisdom of their parents and of their elders? Is it the case that they have moved away from knowledge and ways of being of the past, or is it that because of the acceleration in information technology, is it one of those instances where we're seeing it um, in a much more in our face way because we're open to, if we're here in West Virginia, whatever's happening in California, we can find out that day, that second, because someone posted a video they took on their phone, which is always in their pocket, and posted it to YouTube, and it took like 20 minutes. So is it would we really say that there is, in fact, a greater deviation away from what I'll call wisdom of the past? Or is it merely a seeming of such?
I think people are in this, parents right now are in this like somewhat thrown state because parents of definitely a lower income, they don't have as much time to spend the energy on researching correct parenting methods and now what is known to be healthy. That's debatable whether or not, what they can research is correct or not, because whatever you are searching for, you're going to inevitably find somebody who agrees with you. Um, but I think um, people who don't have enough time to research a good way to parent, but also paired with them disagreeing with how they were raised, those people especially are just making all types of mistakes and not doing anything right. Um, because they don't have the time to research what to do, but they also are not even following the script of their parents. And because they do have the informational age at their fingertips, um, their ability to look it up is there, but again, their energy isn't there if their income is super low and how much they're exerting themselves is super high. Um, yeah.
Okay, there's a couple things there. Though they kind of conflict with each other, but I think energy wise, okay, so what's the difference between how much time people can spend, how much stress they can handle now versus the past? So in the past, you had a kind of greater division of labor, I would argue. So typically speaking, you might have one parent working full time, one parent either working very part time or perhaps not at all, staying home raising the child, or children, I should say, because people tended to have more children in the past. And so, in terms of energy, where nowadays most people work, even if they're both working part time, it's something closer to a full time job than it is, like a small few hours a week for part time work where you're just making some extra pocket money.
And if you're doing part time and raising kids, it's like you have a full time job all the
Yeah,
time, round the clock.
yeah, because just because someone's working part time doesn't mean all the work for raising children is not also there.
Yeah.
However, that kind of conflicts. That makes perfect sense, right? So people nowadays they do not have the time to invest in essentially learning how they need to raise their kids, and perhaps they need to more if they have also abandoned the wisdom of the past, right? So if they are no longer following a tradition, they need something to replace it. The thing about tradition that makes it so useful is that you don't have to have a deep understanding. You just have to repeat the actions that you saw done before. Once you've thrown that out, okay, well, now you can take a different set of actions, but you have to decide of the infinite number of ways I'm going to approach my problems, like which ways do I choose? Because there's an infinite number of ways, and therefore I need to make a set of criteria by which to filter all these infinite number of ways. So there's a narrow constraint of choices that I can make that I can actually decide from. That all takes a lot of time. That all takes a lot of energy, a lot of decision making power.
A lot of responsibility. And that's where I think parents are relying on the school system now. They're opting out of their responsibility to research what correctly to do, and they throw their kids into, well, I teach pre-K, kindergarten, and first grade. They're throwing these kids, unreally parented um, children, into the school system, hoping that the school system will teach their kids the correct way to be. And they're not capable of doing that. And they're past the point at the 4-year-old stage of even being capable of a large degree of change. They're already past that point. And I think parents are just avoiding their responsibility. I think if the baseline interest is not there of the parent of wanting to develop themselves and be a good person, and like they're not, they're just, what would you call that, like pushing off that responsibility onto others, onto the school system, those children, they can't really be saved after that 4-year point. Unfortunately, they're just they're a stressor to everybody else.
Yeah, little sociopaths, essentially, narcissists. Yeah. So a couple things, like right. So yeah, when someone abandons their job at these early stages before state intervention really comes in. And we really, like, no one, I would hope. Actually, I know people who do want this, but I would hope most people do not want, let's say, state intervention at the age of something like 2 or younger. That's incredibly invasive. And to be honest, we've seen the lackluster job that, let's say, just foisting your kid off to the state does now. I imagine that there would be more damage. The reason why I think there would be more damage is actually because of that bit of conflict I mentioned earlier, right? So we talked about people not having time because everyone's working, so they're essentially parenting less, and then giving that off to the state so they can work more. But you had mentioned the fact that, parents used to not have, or lower income people might not have the time to then research all of this. But people of the past also didn't have access to this technology, right? They didn't have libraries of information. There was not as much research. And a thought occurred to me as you were describing that. And that thought was because they didn't have access to libraries of information, they had to rely on tradition. There wasn't another option for them. So the very idea that you could be successful in some set of parenting strategies outside of the tradition didn't occur to most people. And so what that meant was that for most people, you have your kids. Well, the tradition is someone needs to stay home with these kids and to raise them while they're very young. And because that was the tradition, that's what they did. The idea that you would, let's say, just unless you were of like the highest social strata and you had like a couple like nannies, or if you go back far enough in time, you have like essentially like a wet nurse that also kind of raised you as you got older. But even then, that's like one-on-one parenting. That's not
Yeah.
like that's way different than,
Well, yeah, they know in terms of like attachment styles, it actually does not matter. Um, if it's directly your mom, if you have a mothering figure that is you're very closely connected with and attached to, and they meet your needs, it doesn't matter if it's a nanny one-on-one with a baby or if it's the direct mother, um, as long as they have somebody they can dependently rely on and they are having their needs met, it does not matter. Um, yeah, they'll end up secure attachment.
Yeah, so even in the past when we had, the
Wet
aristocracy,
nurses.
yeah, the
Yeah.
aristocracy having someone else raise their kids, it was still essentially along the lines of the tradition because that option wasn't there. It seems to me that in our arrogance, I would say, we think that we can make everything scientific. And the problem with that is when you set up a theory, it will seem to work, but the real test is when you implement it, right? Because the theory takes into account a number of assumptions, just like if you can have a perfect mathematical formula, but if you don't put in the right numbers, the answer you get is wrong. And something analogous to that. It's a little bit different than the mathematical formula, but I think that comes into play when we think, okay, let's do this research. We have some data and we can extrapolate some things from that data. And if we assume that that's the whole picture, right? If we assume there is nothing else to look for, then, oh, this should work, shouldn't it? So let's set up this huge state apparatus with all these resources and let's try to implement this to make it work. And what we end up finding is there are variables that are not taken into account, such as early childhood and the fact that you can't mold children in particular, because right now we're focused on like early education, right? You can't mold children any which way you want, because they have stages of development, they have background experience, they even perhaps have particular natural predispositions that do or do not make them better or worse candidates for the way that we set up school, right? Because like if you have the classic example is young boys who are super rambunctious and full of energy, you basically have to exhaust them to the nth degree to get them to sit down for any length of time and be able to pay attention.
Yeah.
Yeah, so play ends up being very, very important.
And those kids I see that are like that are labeled as like ADHD, they're kids that they start out very happy and rambunctious, but then because of their natural disposition of like being more hyperactive, they get they go from happy and rambunctious to depressed and having a lot of low self-esteem issues because they attribute their lack of ability to pay attention to a lack of um, intelligence, and it's really not. But when you are reprimanded like every 5 to 10 minutes, they internalize that negative attention. Those kids should not be in schools, I believe, because, then they tell them they need to take medication, and then they will, and that helps them focus, but then they're reliant on a medication when, again, they really should just not be in school. They're capable of actually becoming way more intelligent than the other kids because they have like that extra energy that if funneled towards something they were interested in, they could become great at it. But because the school system is trying to make, like you said before, like just factory workers, like passive people that are just gonna be okay with sitting there, they're gonna think, oh, I need to be different. I need to be calm, where they're going to um, kind of suffocate, like in a way, like their candle of self of being like, okay, I can't be this way. I have to fit in. But in fitting in, they um, give up any potential that they had.
Yeah, at the very least, they're going to be disinterested and they're going to fail anyway,
Yeah.
right? Like I need to like pay attention. Oh, I didn't pay attention. I need to pay attention. Oh, I didn't pay attention.
And it's nonsense stuff other than just English and like basic math. Like they're right. It's like pointless stuff that they're learning. And it's really just because their parents have a job and they can't afford to pay for them to do anything else. So they put them in the school system. They're not there because it will really, really benefit them. They're there because their parents have nowhere else they can put them while they're at work.
Yeah, so functionally, like I haven't mentioned it yet today, but I'm sure I have at some point, and it's well known. The school system is set up to produce factory workers. It's based on the old Prussian model was made to make soldiers, and I think even that Prussian model was based off an older model where you were breaking people in to eventually go into seminary. So you were trying to crush out any resistance they had to being essentially like these perfectly meek, celibate, like priest, basically. But yeah, the Prussian model was soldiers that got converted over into factory workers. This, when it was implemented even here in the United States and elsewhere, was well known because, well, we had industry that we needed to have a bunch of useful factory workers. And now, since we're way past that, it seems to me that most of education is essentially childcare.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and you mentioned the uselessness of a lot of what is learned. That's something that I can perhaps speak to. I taught university courses, and I've mentioned this before on the podcast, but I had a big chunk of students who were functionally illiterate. What do I mean by that? They could, read words. They could kind of write words, but their spelling was so atrocious that it was bizarre because it's like, how are you reading these words? But they could not read sentences. What do I mean by that? So I could write directions, they could not follow those directions because they were spot reading. They were reading certain nouns, certain adjectives, certain verbs. And from those, they were essentially contextualizing what the sentence might mean. And then they would understand, and big air quotes, that. So, you'd ask them to write an essay and sentence after sentence after sentence. It's like two totally separate thoughts just smushed together at a random place. There was no understanding of what they were doing with punctuation. You might think, well, that's just some, particular finicky thing. No, 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 it's not. If you can't figure out where to put a period in a sentence, what that means is you don't know where one thought ends and another thought begins, right? That means you can't separate subjects and predicates from different sentences, which means you don't know what is doing what or what is affecting what. It's a total inarticulate mess. So what does that have to do with the state of education? Well, it suggested to me that children at a very young age, because you can teach children to read at a very young age, and then thereby teach them to write, they're not actually even being educated in the way that the system is ostensibly in the modern day set up to do. It is literally primarily childcare. That would be my assessment. Now, JJ, you have more experience like in the classroom, right? So, for those of you guys who don't know, she's in there with the kids trying to teach them to regulate their emotions because things have gotten so bad that the kids. Well, why don't you tell us you don't mention anything in particular because we don't want you to get in trouble with legal matters, but what is a classroom like now in terms of kids' abilities to and lack thereof control themselves?
a lot of impulsivity, lack of ability to just focus. And honestly, I think where it's coming from is the parents from very young infant stage, um, how our system is set up in terms of maternity leave. We'll start here and then build up. Um, you're allowed to have up to like 2 months of maternity leave. That is not long enough. Not at all in terms of bonding. I think I've kind of said this to myself, and I've thought this: if you as a parent do not prioritize your children as your main responsibility, nobody will. And you should not expect anybody else to put in nearly as much effort as you're supposed to, because nobody's going to love your child like you will. And parents now, especially mothers now, yes, this is probably because also, men aren't doing their part. But I think in terms of mothers, um, they prioritize the status of saying that they are working, and that they're doing what society wants them to do, of like, oh, I can be a good mother and work. I'm in the process now of trying to make sure that I can stop working so I can just be with my kids. But I think this idea that our society is now pushing, that um, you um, not only is it expected for you to be a mom and have a job, but if you don't have a job, that you are like lesser and you're not doing what you should be doing. um, so anyway, so women now will prioritize their career first, push off having children until after their career, which is really bad. And honestly, it doesn't make any sense, because then, women are having a struggle with conceiving later in life in terms of fertility. And then also, once you have this career, now the child becomes the impediment to advancing that career. And then women resentfully look at their children as holding them back, when that is actually their main purpose, to be good mothers. And then it creates a bad relationship between the child and the mom, because they will be like, okay, I will be pregnant, I will be working. And then they spend those 2 months with their baby, and then they go right back into the labor force, and then they spend all their energy, their job, working for somebody else, and then have not a lot of energy to spend towards loving their child. And then that ultimately causes a lack of trust and attachment and bond to their child, which then spirals into their children not trusting others to meet their needs, not trusting others to love them. And then that child operates in a state of not trusting anybody, and then also not respecting anybody, any authority figure or anyone. So they don't even listen to nice, polite commands. So now, finally, getting back to the school system, because they are going from babysitter to a babysitter that does not love and really care for them that much, that views them as just a paycheck. And then the parent comes back home to them stressed, lacking energy. They are basically treated like they are an annoyance, and then they can sense that. And even if you are nice to those type of children that lack that bond, um, they will not listen to you nicely telling them what to do at all. And they don't respect anybody, because they are not respected at home or anywhere they go. So they don't project any authority, or they don't respect any authority, because authorities don't respect them as people that deserve love.
There's quite a lot to respond to there. I'll see if I can get through all of it. One thing that occurred to me that I want to jump on is, yeah, when you mentioned maternity leave, and I thought back to earlier in the conversation, we talked about how people prior the age of information, the proliferation of the internet, and the accessibility of knowledge at the touch of our fingertips or the reach of our fingertips. I wonder if maternity leave actually makes this worse. Here's my thought. if you don't have the option to take those 2 months off, and your option is stay in work or stay home with your child and leave your job, how many more women would choose to stay home with their kids for a longer stretch of time and then as their kids age then look for some manner of employment, right? You can even think of this in terms of technology. Like obviously, we had people end up in situations where something like I don't know, baby formula is necessary. But if we didn't have it and you had to stay home and breastfeed, then you would, in the same situation, like when we only had tradition to go back on, people wouldn't, or women in this case, mothers, young mothers, would not prioritize work because it would not be an option. It actually seems to me that the plethora of options that we have that take us away from our biological imperatives and the restraints that nature imposes on us have led us astray from, well, our nature. And no wonder that then we turn to an institution, right? So an institution of culture, an institution of the state, in this case, schools, to try and make up for, let's say, the turning away from our own natures. So that was one thought, but there were a couple other thoughts there. So that was maternity leave. The other one had to do with um, one had to do with respect and authority, and there was another one that I wanted to cover first, but I'll have to come back around to it because I forget. But in terms of the children not having any respect for authority, and you mentioned that these kids are essentially just a paycheck, and e- either they're a paycheck for some random childcare provider, or they are a nuisance for the parent who is prioritizing working. Um, yeah, absolutely. What we're teaching children is that authority figures are not respectable people. They're not admirable people. They're not people that this child wants to grow up to be. Um, this is perhaps a stray thought, but when I was really little, and particularly in stories and things, but you also see this in life, kids actually admired their parents and they admired adults and they wanted to grow up. However, as I got older, closer to my teenage years, and I've seen this ever since, that desire to be an adult, to be, for kids to say they want to be a grown up, to look at adults as desirable ends disappeared at some point. Maybe it's still around and me personally, I've not seen it, but actually, I suspect it's gone. I don't see it portrayed in the media. I don't see it in, kids that I've interacted with. I didn't see it when I was, like I said, a teenager. From that point onward, it seemed to me that everyone thought that adults were these liars and like hapless idiots. Like the again that turning away from tradition is a kind of turning away from our elders and respect for our elders. And certainly part of that is because none of the parents really did a decent job. They didn't invest in their children, they invested instead in their career. What I did want to ask about was like down at the classroom level, what particular behaviors are we seeing from these kids who don't respect adults? Like what are they doing in the classroom?
So they're asked to, now they have the expectation of, they have these things called centers or station time where they get to pick where they want to go. They have kitchen, they have blocks, they have these different stations. If they don't get what they want, some of them flip out, will run around screaming, flipping over chairs, and just it's like a full blown tantrum that's like uncontrollable until they exhaust their energy. And now, or if they don't, that's one reason, or they are told to clean up and then maybe they aren't expected to clean up at home and then they freak out and do the same thing then, where they go around flipping chairs, screaming. And then when a teacher tries to calm them, they freak out, hit, punch. and these teachers are left with bruises. And the turnover rate of teachers, especially in pre-K, that I've seen is ridiculous because these kids, I've actually advocated to my supervisor to have policies of basically implementing expelling kids in pre-K, because right now in school systems you can expel kids for acting out, but for some reason it does not apply to pre-K, which is completely optional, and it's not even a requirement in general. So these pre-K teachers are essentially getting beat up going to work, and then instead of just kicking out the child and being like, hey, telling the parent, you need to do something because as of right now this child cannot even come to school, they make it an unsafe learning environment for the other children. They are horrible examples the other children are picking up on, and they are taking on some of the same things. They're learning the bad behaviors are acceptable because this child is continually allowed to be there. Whereas if they were kicked out and then the teacher said, hey, this person is no longer a student here, telling the students, because of these behaviors, then there would actually be a learned thing amongst the other students of, okay, that behavior is not acceptable, so I will never do that. Instead, they're seeing these students who act out get extra attention and coddled, and they're being taught that is perfectly acceptable behavior, and it's horrific.
Now, that's a lot of that's for the pre-K level. You said the highest that you go is first grade.
Yeah.
How bad is it at the first grade level? Is it mostly talking out of turn, or do we have kids getting up out of their desks, running around? We have tantrums all the way at, first grade, because pre-K is pretty young. First grade, at that point, my experience is you can actually get first graders to, at the very least, you should be able to get them to cooperate with adults in a classroom setting somewhat. Is it so? How bad is it at the first grade level in your experience?
So kindergarten and first grade, you don't see these full-blown tantrums as much. I think it is also because at the pre-K level, they start, eh, they understand, and they get these kids on medication that are like this. Because if they're that extreme in pre-K, the parents get to a point where the teachers kind of push them, especially if they have the oppositional defiant disorder, which really is just a fancy word for being like, this kid is a bad person. Like they just can't function in society without being medicated. But they typically get them medicated by this point. Now, what I see in terms of behaviors that is acting out is, people talk out of, they interrupt very often. I think it is what they classify as like ADHD. It's kids that are very just like impulsive. Um, from what I've seen, it's not really anger issues at those higher levels, because by that point, the kids are getting that, they're at entering that stage of emotional regulation that comes naturally for a lot of kids by that point. Um, they have incorporated, like kids that are autistic, but who can function in terms of like they have, reading skills, and their speech level is really great. But those kids, they again, they don't act out. They just talk out of interrupting, and it's, but it's not really acting out. It's just them interjecting. But yeah.
Roughly speaking, how many kids are, in your estimation, medicated by the time they reach that first grade point? The reason why I'm asking is I'm trying to see how much of the improvement is actually just masked by drugging children. That's what I
Not
want to.
many, actually. The parents, rightfully so, are resistant to it. I actually only know of um one. Now there may be kids that the parents aren't honest about it, or that they don't tell because they just, do medicate, but it's they keep it on the low or whatever. But a lot of parents are resistant to it. But I think even those parents, I think they have a choice when their kid is that way, of either medicating them or them needing to pull the child out of school because they cannot be taught in school in a like 20, 25, 27 like class size, they just cannot function well. But I think parents should have a choice, or they should at least know that their choices are two choices: either medicate and don't be against medication, or they need to take on the responsibility to find an option that is better for their kid that is not formal schooling, whether that be homeschooling, or I know a lot of these parents don't have this ability, but private schooling where they have smaller classes and more attention per child, because these kids not picking either option and doing what a lot of the parents are doing, which is being like, no, I'm not going to medicate my child. I'm also not going to acknowledge anything they're experiencing is an issue, and just leaving them with no help and expecting them to just eventually conform is, again, it's going to cause, and it is causing these children anxiety, depression, negative self images, and negative recurring phrases they say aloud um, about just super low self esteem. And it's not the child's fault, it's their parents' fault.
So are you suggesting there that the misbehavior earlier on, if it's not drugged, which it doesn't seem like a ton of it's, kids being drugged, is going from external tantrums to internal deteriorating mental health.
Yes, yes, it is that for
Okay.
sure.
And that's a large part of those interjections you'd mentioned earlier then.
Yes.
Okay, so what we're seeing there is when a child is very young, they act out the lack of parental acculturation. The kids who are there who otherwise would be okay get, let's say, socialize laterally instead of vertically, which means instead of improving, they learn primarily from their peers at an age when that's not proper, right? When in nature, a child would be surrounded by mostly adults who are teaching them how to be a functional, civilized human being. Instead, they learn, okay, here are these other barbarians in a class of 10, maybe 20, maybe 30 other barbarians. I learn these misbehaviors. I essentially tantrum. I become when I use the word, I kind of don't like the word narcissistic, but they do not develop a theory of mind, including other people, very well. And so they're, in that sense, kind of almost psychopathic, right? Because they're not even, you know, a sociopath might not care that they're hurting you, but they know that you are you, right? There's a level of sophistication there that someone develops into. But when someone is doing it purely unconsciously, it's closer to someone who just does not understand that other people have feelings.
Yeah, like see, I do small groups with these pre-K kids specifically that act out and will, like I said, punch, hit like teachers when they're trying to help them calm down, and after they're like going around flipping chairs, yelling, everything. And what's weird, what I thought was weird at first was I was like, okay, I'm going to politely educate them correct ways to be, because maybe it's a lack of understanding or ever even knowing right from wrong. And then what striked me as weird was they know exactly what is right and what is wrong. They just choose to act out wrongly, whether that's from a lack of ability through impulsivity, which actually um, getting to know some of these kids' backgrounds that are super like that. There was a kid last year that was this way, and then again this year. Um, Specifically, the ones that act out in anger and impulsivity and know what is morally correct, but choose to do what is wrong. They typically come from addict mothers, um, and it is genetic, which is sad because it's like, they literally did not have control over that. And but when that does happen, I think for those specific individuals, I don't think even homeschooling for them, like they don't have ADHD, they have something else that is genetic.
By genetic, do you mean like heritable, like they were prenatal, like in the womb to an addict mother, suffered some type of withdrawal in infancy that then, caused damage to their brain development, so their
Yes.
impulse. Okay.
Yeah, like those people specifically, I'm typically not like I don't advocate a lot for the medicating of children because I think for at least the ADHD children, they are perfectly intellectually capable, but they just are not in the correct environment. Because when I have small groups with ADHD kids, they can actually focus and they're very intelligent, more intelligent actually than some of the kids that are focused. But the kids that have that oppositional defiant disorder that act out angrily, they need medication if they're going to be a functional member of society and have any possibility of having a good life at all or any good relationships.
Do you think that if, because this population of kids, it reminds me of something. Jordan Peterson, he did a number of interviews and talked to different people who were specialists in this about. He said essentially if there's like something like 30% of kids, and in that 30%, they're going to have a proclivity that leads them to bite, to hit, to basically be aggressive and violent. And you can socialize them, usually between the ages of 2 and 4, to be civilized human beings. Like maybe it takes some effort, but you can train them to do that. Now, given that these kids perhaps have damage from something equivalent of like fetal alcohol syndrome or whatever the equivalents are with harder drugs. I imagine heroin use is a thing in this particular area. Do you think that if they had better experiences, right, despite the damage, so the damage obviously is there, but if they had been socialized properly between the ages of 2 and 4 before they end up in a classroom with
Yes.
you, that they could be functional without needing further medication, or do you suspect that the damage done is too much, or can you not tell? Because it's hard to tell from afterwards.
Well, it's hard to tell. I imagine that they exactly what you said, like if they were intervened between that age, they would be capable maybe of not having medication. But in these two specific um or I have three specific examples in my mind. So two of the kids that acted out in anger, they came from like mothers who were addicts, and then they were adopted by people who were not. But that severing of the connection with the parent, um, added with um, having uh, that addictness like in the womb and after or whatever. Like I think it's um, even if the adopted parent was better, in a lot of ways, that severing of the connection with their parent that they were connected with, that parent was struggling and had issues, combined with the impulsivity coming from the genetic changes, and then going to an adoptive parent that, although they have good intentions, that parent is going to view that child, they enter into an adoptive situation because they want to be good people, but then they get these babies that have issues, and then inevitably they treat them like how we're talking about parents that even with their own children kind of give them away to being watched by other people from a young age. They view the child resentfully, and they don't want to give the child up because that would be, it'd be horrible for the baby to go from one person to the next, but then they treat that child badly because it's not their child. And then the issues that they develop, they view as not their issues. And then they treat this child badly. And I think that's during that window of 2 to 4 when possibly the child could have been reformed. They've been treating like they've been being treated like they are an added stressor because they are, unfortunately, to the adoptive parents, that the adoptive parents have a problem. They're part of the problem.
So it's not that it couldn't happen, it's that it's unlikely to happen that they get the proper socialization they need at that time due to the circumstances. And I'm sitting here thinking how this all fits together. So this reminds me of Brave New World, right? So in the novel, I think Aldous is how you pronounce his first name. I think Aldous Huxley. He has these. I think they're the Deltas, maybe they're the lower rank people, and they're essentially made to be like factory workers, but they're all given soma. Now, soma is like a perfectly engineered drug with no downsides that numbs people to their pain, and it lets them just accept their menial existence. And these people are essentially genetically crafted to not really want anything more than that. And I'm looking at the way that, because again, this
That sounds like weed to me.
a bit, yeah, right. There's, I'm sure there's some listeners out there who are responsible smokers. So I apologize if
I'm not saying that in a bad way. I have smoked weed at times in my life, and I did like that it did calm me and being okay with my situation. But I do think it does impede people from bettering their situation, though,
yeah.
if you are not already doing that while engaging responsibly.
Yeah, we'll take the Joe Rogan position where probably like, does not advocate for youth. If you're an adult, it's like drink responsibly. But I'm looking at this, and the whole system seems to me set up to produce the kind of Delta Brave New World factory workers. Here's why. So you have kids who are damaged, you have kids who are not socialized, you've got parents who are essentially encouraged to get their kids into some type of institution rather than parenting them. And that is affecting kids who might otherwise be well socialized through this kind of lateral deterioration, right? They're learning bad things from their peers. We have at the very young age these let's say in terms of pre-K, perhaps even kindergarten, you've got total outbursts being present. And what ends up happening is that those cause mental deterioration as they get older. So essentially, you have these kids now internalizing by the time they are more in the school system. So it looks like the problem disappears, but either the problem is being drugged away, which if to solve your let's say behavioral problems, if you know to solve your biological issues, your proclivities with drugs, well, what does that like? What road does that lead you down? That's a question. And if you have all these mental issues that are essentially unresolved, that are they're not going to be able to be handled. Like it can teach you how to handle your emotions in a classroom setting so that you don't burst out and throw a tantrum in the classroom. But that doesn't mean that someone's not going to develop like depressive disorder when they become an adult, right?
It stops the storm outside of them. It stops them from creating that outside, but then it's like still inside. So I think it could lead, well, it does lead from even from the young age. There was like a girl last year that she was like self-harming in ways, and it's I think well, we already know what it leads to suicide, leads to shootings, it leads to people having either becoming bullies to people that they don't have relationships to, or them actually becoming bad to people who they are in relationships with and taking it out on them, believing that everybody else is the issue but them. And I think I'm seeing also, I was struck by this, like they're teaching way earlier, like in pre-K, these concepts that I remember learning in first grade and second grade, like alphabet and all this stuff, and they are really trying to go really fast with learning stuff like this. Whereas I know in like Japan and places, they don't even think about trying to train the children in any way. Um, Educationally, it's more about letting them, or getting them accustomed to listening to authority and just getting along with each other. But now instead we have the opposite in America, where they're trying to push the educational aspects so early. And especially you see this with kids that are struggling at home with these like really dark situations at home, where they're like they cannot leave, and not even adults can do this. They can't leave their home issues at home, so they're bringing them into school. These kids, a lot of them, they need therapy. Like they don't need to be in school. They need to talk through these issues, because instead of their parents like pretending they're not there and then just trying to do everything they can to give them good experiences, like the kids, they know something's wrong, but the parents aren't talking to them in a way that is acknowledging the pain that they've gone through. So the kids can't move on. Like, you can't, if you can't take away the trauma they've been through, you kind of have to accept that the child has to, they're forced to grow up faster than other kids. But it's better to have those deep talks to those kids rather than to pretend the issues aren't there and then have the child internalize it as something wrong with them instead of something wrong that happened to them, you know?
Yeah, essentially, what the kids need to be learning at that very young age is how to process and regulate their own emotions in a way that both works within them and without them. And instead of doing that, what we've done is thrown the kids um, essentially to an institution that is trying to educate them, whereas it would be better to socialize them because you can't successfully educate a kid who fails at being properly socialized. And even if you might succeed, the mental health issues down the road cause greater problems. Now, a thought occurred to me that there's a component we haven't talked about yet. So we've talked about moms, how moms are essentially abandoning being moms so that they can go to work. How this is part of the reason why these kids are not being socialized. What else, what other figure have we not mentioned that is perhaps missing both at home often and also definitely 100% missing in almost every classroom?
The dads are, even if the child does have a two-parent household, it's weird because dads have kept the mentality of like they need to have a job, but the job that they are having, they're like, okay, as long as I have a job, they feel they're fulfilling their duties as a parent. But even though now both mom and dad typically have a job, the mom will be doing a job and then also doing the job of raising the children at home, keeping that traditional role when they're at home. But the dads are now opting out of it, even though things are split down the middle now. Dads are um, kind of trying to keep that state that they're younger engaging in terms of like um this is personal for me, but like men having jobs and then coming home and then playing video games or doing everything but being the parent role because they are in a state of wanting to deny that, the accepting of new responsibilities, whereas moms still have that feeling that it is their responsibility, but now they have the added stressor of a job too. So society is expecting them to have a job. The dad is expecting them to be a mom. And then, so they're juggling both. And then I would even put this on grandparents too, because of how nowadays people are obese and older people have deteriorating health that they are band-aiding with medications. The grandparents are unfit and incapable of doing their part that they used to do, which was helping out more with grandchildren to where so the parents aren't getting enough breaks, moms aren't getting breaks, grandparents aren't doing their job, dad's not doing their job, mom's taking on too much responsibilities. Um, and then the children are just they're just in it and they are like just hating life basically because they're like, you know, they feel resented everywhere they go, you know. Um,
Yeah, so that's at the home level, right? So you've got the guys trying to live like bachelors, even once they have, have a family. Once they, even after they have kids, it's um, the sacrifices that you have to make to be involved in your child's life and the responsibilities that you need to take in order to essentially be their primary educator. This is the way that I view it, and you can tell me if this fits in. What should happen is there should be some form of negotiate. I'm very, let's say, classically liberal actually in my sentiments because that's how I grew up, right? A kid born in the early 90s. But, you know, it should be a negotiated set of roles. So you've got a mom and your dad, and you figure out, okay, how are we going to split these things so that we're each happy? And part of it is that the guys don't want to grow up because they don't want to take on the roles of dad because that requires the sacrifice of being the delayed adolescent, most fundamentally, right? Because you can be a teenage guy and you can have a job and you can come home and you can play video games all night and sleep in all day and then rinse repeat that your whole like youth, and that you can get by doing that by yourself. But what we're saying is like once you have a family, not only do you have your job, but you need to take the time out to, and this is my argument, because I think part of the negotiated role inevitably is going to be that your dad, the dad, teaches you certain things, not everything, but is your early life primary educator. I think specifically insofar as how one learns to interact with other people. And why do I think that? Well, I think that because your dad typically will enforce boundaries much more consistently, and more often than most moms typically will. I think that's because dads don't have as deep a biological connection. Like, your dad, you don't carry a child in you. Your entire neurology doesn't gear to making sure this infant has its like needs met every second that it needs them, because when you're an infant and you're like not even 6 months old, like you're basically should still be inside the mother, but we have a weird evolutionary history that led to that not happening. And so what I'm seeing here is like without the dad there fulfilling that role, the kid isn't being socialized well. The kid not being socialized well is going to add to the stress of the mother also working and then also having to do the home roles and also doing the dad's job, which she's not, it's a geared to do. Like it's not proper biologically speaking.
And I think it creates a bad dynamic of, um, especially men, when they have mothers that take on the punisher role and the loving role, it creates a anger towards women in general, which is, they will eventually take out on their spouses or girlfriends later because they have this conflict of, um, I think we're supposed to view women as, lovers, caretakers, like soft beings. But then when you have a mother who had to be forced into this punisher role also, um, which they're not supposed to be, it just creates an anger towards women in general.
Yeah, because that's how abusive people are, right? Like if there's a classic abuser, they will flip between being like kind of love bombing you and then switch to the abuse and then kind of
And then
use.
comfort you after, which it's the abusive cycle. Yeah.
Yeah, so forcing, we could almost say, forcing women to occupy contradictory roles on top of other roles that also inhibit the nurturing role. So they have the nurturing role that's being inhibited, and then you have let's say, we'll call it the disciplinarian, right? The one who maintains discipline amongst the children. That's socialization. That's necessary for them to learn, because we're going to wrap this back around into education. I guess this is more like early childhood, right? But yeah, taking on being forced is perhaps a strong word, but tricked gold by society into occupying contradictory roles. And so they end up functioning like someone who was trying to abuse you, psychologically speaking, which is actually really dark because then it sets us up for um, the educational system where now we also don't have male figures in that almost anywhere.
Yeah,
Um,
it's not at all present. And now that we're talking about this with the women occupying both the loving caretaking and it being polluted by them needing to become disciplinarians because the dads aren't doing it, well, because men are not teachers and women are all the teachers, they are trying to do both, which again is creating that resentment towards women because the women teachers are, I will see them giving hugs to students and then seeing them, reprimand students, and it's polluting again that like feminine energy, I think. Um, so it's making, men just hate women because they have all these negative experiences, like compiling of their mom disciplining them and then all these like bitter, resentful, angry, older, unfit women reprimanding them, and they just it turns into just like hating women and then not treating women well because they have all these negative experiences with women when it used to be, your mother would be loving, your grandmother would be loving, and you just saw women as loving. I don't think there was probably a whole lot of anger towards women, whereas now I think it's like the opposite. And then also, well, women are getting entitled now too, so in like other ways. But I think at least in terms of why relationships aren't working out and how men are becoming less and less capable of um, tying women down, it's because they don't have good relationships with women in their
Yeah. It's
lives.
like a cycle, right? It's
Yeah.
a feedback loop. So, in insofar as you have experiences that are, let's say, contradictory with women, you get more guys who are less able to make successful relationships with women. So they're going to stick with the late adolescents. They're going to be eternal bachelors, Peter Pans. Insofar as they're Peter Pans, guess what they're not doing if they end up having kids? They're not being good dads to their kids because they're off being Peter Pans,
Yeah.
not fulfilling that role. So what happens to those kids? Well, they have moms who have to fulfill both roles. They go into the school where it's all women fulfilling both of those contradictory roles, right? Which then produces more, which then
Yeah.
produces more.
So
And
it's just men hating women, women hating men. Women are hating men for forcing them into the roles. Men are hating women because, they got that conflicting role with their own mother. So
yeah, so it's kind of a destruction of, not even kind of, it is a destruction of the family unit, um, spiraling downward very rapidly. And in terms of education, uh, now we mentioned that we resort to drugging sometimes, for these kids, but we are definitely seeing that they are, would say, because they are not socialized, they don't have a dad in the home at that young age, and they don't have that masculine figure to keep order. That even if you can make them, so oh, that's super interesting because what that reveals is we don't have men involved in the education of children; it's only women. Even if you can get them to be disciplined, which we are having a hard time doing, they still have outbursts. They're still having kind of neurotic breaks. Um, Even if you can do it, it's going to have negative effects down the road because you're taking that feminine image and you are forcing it into kind of the archetype of the witch, right? One of the archetypes of the witch, which is this kind of bitter, um, you know, hateful, old woman. And
that's a lot of them. That's a lot of teachers.
yeah, when in reality, we talked off microphone, I guess, because we're not on camera. We talked off microphone about this, just the matter of one's voice making a difference, right? So even the difference between men and women's voices, the depth that men's voices have, even just that, oftentimes is sufficient to, without yelling. I'm not talking about yelling, just the resonance of the voice helps to keep children in line, in a way that otherwise a woman might be have to resort to something more extreme than,
Or general passive aggressiveness.
yeah,
Like
yeah.
I hear, so there's a teacher in particular, she will bring attention to a child's like bad behavior in a passive aggressive, well, all the children's behavior in a passive aggressive way of being, I don't even know how to describe
Well,
it.
so wait. This is like a Twitter mob. Because look, this is what this is, right? So you get a class. This is great. There's a class of children, and essentially because you perhaps are bitter and you don't really have the means to control them, so you enter this passive aggressive mode, and what you do is you make some nasty comment that is made to make all the other kids hate that kid,
Yeah,
right? But
yeah,
that's like the Twitter age, right? Where I'm going to call this person a bad word so that everyone knows that you're a bad person and hates you. I'm going to lever society against you, using essentially shame tactics and
yeah.
deception.
They are shame tactics because like the kids that do speak out and they do have attention deficit like issues, these teachers will paint on them with bad intention, as if their lack of ability to control their interruptions is a lack of respect, whereas well, it's not. But also, it's kind of like, well, if you're being passive aggressively dug at all the time by this teacher, and you're also somebody who's not just going to lay down and take it, yes, you're going to chime in often, just because you don't have any respect for somebody who doesn't have respect for you. um
So they're learning disrespect, right?
yes, yeah, because they're being disrespected, so that they're going to give it right back. And then all the other children who are listening to this are kind of just in fear of being like, well, I don't want to be the target, so I'll be quiet. But it's teaching people to become sheeple and just watching instead of actually, this is a big thing. I don't see anymore, at least at the level that I'm teaching, I don't see any bullies practically. um the teachers have become bullies
Ooh, that's
to keep
worse.
them all in line.
Yeah, that to me that sounds worse because like
Yeah,
if another kid is a bully, the potential is that maybe justice comes down from the top or some kid
there's
stands
no
up.
justice comes when it's the teacher.
Yeah, it's just tyranny from the top down, and that's what you get used to, right?
Yeah,
Which of course makes people primed to deal with it when they're
yeah.
adults.
And I see this especially now, obviously not all teachers. There are some teachers who lead with like respect and calmness. But for the teachers that are like this, especially more in the more low income schools, they are master charlatans in terms of putting on great shows about making sure the kids are doing crafts, and even like doing a lot of the craft themselves just so they have something good to show at home and show the school they're doing. But when it comes to interacting with the children, they will often speak up, yell, all these like things, but they are just really good at putting on a show as if they are not being bullies when I believe that they are.
Yeah, oh, this is
It runs
atrocious.
deep.
Yeah, so essentially, because the beginning of this was like, what is the state of education? And so what we have is we had a system that was made to make soldiers, then a system that was made to make factory workers. At the beginning, I suggested it was essentially a daycare situation, but actually, what it seems to me is another apparatus, except instead of factory workers, it seems like it is a system designed to produce dependent, right? Because they are dependent on the institution, these kids. They are not functional, independent units, but they're
They'll
dependent.
overly baby them, but also mistreat them.
Yeah, so they're backbiting, pernicious, narcissistic, dependent units. So this is sort of like Rousseau's Savage. And I actually had this thought in my head since the beginning of this being a kind of um, Rousseauian versus Hobbesian dynamic. So, for those of you guys who don't know, Rousseau essentially said, okay, human beings are born perfectly good, and it's society that makes them bad. Hobbes thought just the opposite, that the nature of humanity was brutish, and that society. Enculturates us and civilizes us and makes us capable of living together in a society. Now, what the school system has set up, or the way it's set up, I should say, is that parents are not parenting their kids. So what that means is by the time they get into the system, which is around the age, I think we're pretty what, 4 years old, right?
Yeah, 3 to 4.
3 to 4. So by the time they're in the institution, which is actually way earlier than when I was a kid. When I was a kid, you started like they had preschool at 5 at the
Yeah,
earliest.
well, it's like three is the earliest age, but yeah, four or
Yeah.
five is more
What
normal. But
at that young age, a couple years is a long time,
yeah,
right?
it
You go
is.
from being 2 to 4, you're way different.
Yeah.
So we've got these kids. They're going in at an early age. They have had some socialization stripped away from them. So again, this is kind of a Rousseauian ideal, right? Like get if we could just get them away from socialization, they should retain their innocence and goodness. Of course, what we see is that actually, if you don't socialize your kid, if the dad isn't present, enforcing boundaries, if the mom isn't present because she's resentful and doing too much, then the kid comes in a Hobbesian state of nature, right? and it starts throwing tantrums, is running around, it has zero impulse control.
These are COVID kids we're dealing with. This is why they're so bad. Like even the teachers that I'm talking with, they're being like, a couple years ago, this wasn't a thing. It's from the kids lacking socialization early and their parents either being fearmongers about, being fearing death itself, or just staying inside, and then them latching onto screens and not developing a personality, just, you know.
Oh, so what we're seeing here, because I was curious, because when you brought up COVID just now, I was like, oh, how does that interplay? So let me see if I understand you correctly. So we had COVID hit, people were all stuck inside, and it's not like all of a sudden, you might think, because some of us thought this, and for a couple of weeks it seemed like it might be the case at the beginning of COVID when we didn't know how severe or unsevere it was going to be, that people would come together, that people would actually start becoming closer because we had this, it was 2 weeks to flatten the curve type of deal, right? That, okay, well, why don't we take this time to be more communal? But the thing is, you had the same ineffectual parents and overloaded parents that you had before. It was just the situation changed, not the people. And so, of course, when people are stuck inside for long stretches of time, do they suddenly become good parents? No, you just mentioned,
They get more stressed.
yeah, they're stressed out and they just stick their kids in front of screens, right?
Yeah, yep. They just, yeah.
Yeah, so it's actually in a case worse.
Mhm.
It's worse because where these kids might be going to at least interact and see other people, even if it's suboptimal, even if it's bad, when they have none of that, zero, it's all screens, all TikTok, all YouTube shorts, because kids are basically addicted to short form content, or I don't know, just watching Let's Plays all day. It doesn't matter really. They're interacting with a flat piece of plastic.
They're not developing themselves at all.
Yeah. So you have these kids coming in. So these are even more so Rousseau Savage than I originally thought. And they come in, and there's no masculine figure, so there's no discipline really maintained. There's only um, passive aggression, which is hidden. And so we fail to socialize them at that level as well. And what we end up with, so for those of you who don't know, Rousseau's goal was to have someone who was essentially atomized. So they were dependent on no individual because all were collectively dependent on the state, and the state would provide all needs. And so therefore it was it was as if you were free because you were dependent on no other people. But being dependent on no other people is the same as saying that you have no relationships with any
Yeah,
other people, right? And those relationships, like the relationship you have with your dad and your mom, are what socialize you. That's what Hobbes would say brings you to be a civilized human being, is how is it that you are made to relate to other people. And really, it seems to me that we had soldiers, we had factory workers. Now we have uh,
they're all selfish.
yes, sheeple, selfish sheeple, right?
Yeah,
The Rousseau's atomized savage. It really seems to me that who is so dependent on, you mentioned essentially some very variant of distraction or drugging, which may very well end up from distraction to, drugs. We see that a lot here in West Virginia. Heroin's a huge, opiates in general are a huge problem. But anything, right? It could be, we complain often off the microphone about the addiction to, like, let's say sugar, for instance, and just mashing sweet tasting
oh yeah.
things down
Well,
one's
there's
face.
we should do a whole different
Yeah.
podcast in that. But I should correct. Not all of them are selfish, but the ones that are um more selfless and actually interact with the other kids and are interested in the others' way, they are very rare. And there's probably maybe like maximum like two per class of like 15 that are actually socialized well and aren't selfish. But again, like that's a large chunk that are not that way and that are selfish. Like,
I think that goes all the way up to the university level too, because I could say the same thing about, this has to do with performance, but I think there's a correlation here, and it very well may have some causal link down the chain. When I had a class of 2022 adult students, it was maybe two to three people who were writing at something close to the level that they ought to be at that age. Um, and it was at most a quarter of the class who could really write it all. And what that suggests to me is that you have this tiny proportion of people, my guess, is that are correctly socialized. And those people go on to develop the skills of being able to articulate themselves, to be able to, I think, have the fundamental building blocks to be independent beings in the world. Like these are going to be people who have successful families, successful jobs. Perhaps they, if their big thing is career, these people are going to end up being, if not entrepreneurs, part of something significant. They're not going to be what we would refer to now as like a wage slave, just grinding by day after day, hating their lives, hating their families, their children, being stressed out, right? These are going to be the people who are going to be able to be home, or at least have their mom home with their kids, because they're gonna figure it out. And the reason that they're going to be able to figure it out is because they know how to control their own emotional states. So they know how to regulate themselves and what to give themselves to meet their own needs. And they can also do that with other people.
And this makes sense on a macro perspective. Those people are able to coexist. And it makes sense to why right now, in terms of politics, it used to be, from what I've heard, people wouldn't get so heated and angry because they could listen, they could socialize with other people and not get angry. Because people thought less selfishly when they were socially interacting more often with, everybody. But now it makes sense to why politically everybody is so angry and they just cannot get along and communicate, because this is how people are now from the youngest age of schooling. They are selfish. They can only view things through their tiny perspective. They cannot listen. They barely understand their own position. So that then when they listen to other people, they cannot even understand others because they can't understand themselves. And they're actually not even interested in understanding anybody else. Um, yeah.
They're not interested in understanding themselves either,
Yeah.
right? So yeah, I would say that in the past, people definitely still got as heated. There's a couple things like in American history, there were a few duels fought over politics where the politicians just went out and shot each other.
Yeah.
Also in Britain, the way that the distance of the two different benches is two sword lengths apart, so that if they had swords, they couldn't cut each other. That's the reason for that, right? And so, perhaps people always get angry, but the perception bit, I think that is 1000% correct. Absolutely, people, they don't perceive the world in the same way. It's like someone who does not have a theory of mind. They cannot understand how other people think and feel. And to be honest, I think you gain that ability through understanding yourself, right? If I understand the different array of things that cause me pain and what I like and dislike, then I could say, okay, I understand if I would experience this, this is how I would end up feeling. And that's a prerequisite to understanding, okay, I know what it's like to lose and feel bad. When someone else loses, they probably feel bad like I feel. You need that building block. You need to understand what brings you to certain emotional states, to understand that different things could also bring other people to different emotional states. And
And the curiosity, which I think is intelligence based, and socialization brings it on, but actually caring to ask other people um, about their dispositions, which people are now selfish. They don't care. Genuinely, they do not care. They do not want to even ask how other people um, feel about certain things. And even if they were told, they basically are so resistant. They don't. They don't even care to listen. I really think they don't care to ask. They don't care to listen. And even when they are told, they can only hear their own um, dispositions. I don't.
yeah, it's what it seems to me is that we took out tradition by its knees, right? We took that out, and then we thought, okay, we can replace this with a some type of progressive institution. Essentially, by progressive, I mean moving away from tradition towards some, in this case, enlightened end, right? So, oh, we know what we're doing. We're going to do this perhaps scientifically. But what we didn't realize is that when we took the tradition away, and when we gave all these other opportunities and options, and we what we did is we disincentivized people and continue to disincentivize people, and then also to condition them, so disincentivize them away from healthy behavioral patterns and have conditioned them to actually adopt, say, antisocial behaviors, antisocial modes of being, emotional dysregulation. And then now what we're doing is we're trying to go back and like band-aid the problem, but the issue is the machine itself, right? The thing that is not ostensibly supposed to be an educational system. I would actually argue it's doing a terrible job. People are not getting more intelligent. Oh, intelligence is the wrong word. They're not learning more useful skills. They are, in a large sense, learning many fewer. So it's not doing that. It seems to me to be an enculturation machine, and it seems to actually be giving us a pathological culture of Rousseauian atomized hyper individualism, which is divorced from family most fundamentally.
We're
Uh,
communal creatures.
yeah,
Like humans cannot deny it. I think also on you know, TikTok and all these different media platforms, people are focusing on being like, too much on independence, especially for women too. Like I listen and have listened to in the past a lot of like female music, and it's like, you don't need a man, you can do it all on yourself, and which is bad because then they want a man to fulfill that like parent male role. But then again, it's like, yeah, but the man doesn't feel needed. So then he's like, well, you know,
yeah. Why
what?
should I, right? Like
Yeah.
if I don't fulfill any special role, if I'm not necessary, if I'm merely an appendage, an accessory, then the feminists were complaining about that forever. Well, women are just accessories. It's like, okay, that's not good if it's the case. By the way, it's not the case because, like, if you have children, you're not an accessory. You're
Well,
a
yeah.
necessary pillar to keep the house up.
Yeah, that's the thing though. And it's funny because what I think is also feeding into and causing men to continue the like, oh, I'll have a job, but not like a super successful job that makes me a good amount of money. But also I'm gonna play video games and like kind of shit away time in a lot of ways because they're like, well, yeah, because my woman has like a job also, so I don't need to make a lot of money. I need to just skate by and then have fun. And then the woman thinks it's okay until they get pregnant and until they're like, damn, I got with this guy who is okay with me doing this work, but now I cannot do this work if I want to be a good mom. But it's like after the fact, they already chose a guy, that was okay with that lack of effort. And then I think this is what's leading to separations after children come, because then they only start thinking with their head on their shoulders once it happens. And I'm talking about myself too, but from direct experience. But yeah.
Yeah, in grad school, I think this is a great place to wrap this up. In grad school, there was one of my fellow students, and it was a workshop we did, and I can't remember what the prompt was, but she did this massive projection where she wrote about, I think it was a poem we had to write. It was a poetry workshop, because it was all combined in the creative writing sphere of poetry, not creative nonfiction, fiction. And there was, I can't remember how she wrote it, but there was an experience where she was describing herself sitting on the couch and her boyfriend was on the couch. They were both just sitting there, not paying any attention to each other, smoking weed. He was playing video games and she was like staring off into the distance, like bemoaning existence. And it's like that's exactly what people are going through. And you get into that, then you have kids, and then all of a sudden, well, you expect your partner to suddenly change, but um, I think that's the mistake being made. We are thinking that we can occupy the state of delayed adolescence. We're not taking responsibility, most fundamentally, with the idea that the biggest responsibility that you have is to your children, to pass down something to them to keep the world going rather than being an Epicurean, right? Just relishing in the pleasures of the moment. And I think that we have facilitated that in large part through our institutions. And I think that, let's say, schools at this point, what is the function? What is the telos of our education system? And I think it is to produce and reproduce more of that, right? It's like the production of Peter Pans and you know, disillusioned women who are bitter. So it's like we're producing overgrown man children and bitter evil witches, and
Or
to
like selfish women, that like they try to get their attention through internet, which that's what we're seeing.
yeah,
Because
OnlyFans, right?
well, OnlyFans will even just TikTok. Well, I see a lot of like women on YouTube and TikTok that will be doing all these like mothering things to their boyfriends. And I'm like, they would be great moms, but they are afraid of taking on that responsibility. But then they are mothering their boyfriends, with which the moment that they do, if they do have children, that man is going to then resent the child because they've been giving mom energy to their spouses, to their boyfriends, and then it causes a bad relationship between the father and the child because they're like, hey, she was my mom, you know?
Yeah. Cool.
Yep, that's a whole nother thing though.
Yeah. All right. Well, thank you guys for joining us on this conversation on the state of education as a machination to destroy the family. There we go. That's a good ending, right? So before you go, I'd like to send you all once again to wildislet.com. Again, check out my fiction posted there, both stories, excerpts, and my novel, One Smoke Broken. First chapter available free. Whole book on audio available for free as well. I'd really appreciate it if you checked it out. I've got essays as well, blog posts, particularly covering a range of Eastern philosophy. I've been wading through all the classics. I almost got through them all. So I don't know what I'm going to do after that. That's not true. I do know what I'm going to do. But you'll find out about that again if you go over to wildislet.com. And lastly, while you're there, check out the Wild Isle Style Guide. You can hire me to help you write your essay, write your manuscript in style if you are an author of any form of fiction, or if you're writing a memoir, that'll work too. I can help you really embed, let's say, music into your prose, compose your prose with music, as I like to say. That's enough of me trying to be clever. We'll see you guys next time.